Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the depraved mad scientist whose world-ending doomsday device is now 97% operational.
I'm Dr. Doofenshmirtz. Actually, I am Dr. Trent Hergenrader, but Dr. Doofenshmirtz is a good role model from Phineas and Ferb.
I was going to say, do we have to pay royalties to Disney for using the name Doofenshmirtz? Are they going to come after us?
I don't think so. We've cited it.
I hope not. And I mean, the reason why we bring up Dr. Doofenshmirtz is because this week we're turning our attention to world building in STEM education. And in both the book and the podcast, we've dabbled with examples of science and math-based world building projects, but we haven't gone deep into the unique opportunities and challenges of designing for those kinds of environments. Before we get into that, I wanted to clarify that because world building and world modeling are interdisciplinary, engineering and math and biology and physics and chemistry, they aren't manifestly different than the other subjects we've talked about. It's just that inquiry and role play in STEM usually involves technical, tool-based information that you would not typically apply in a humanities environment, and so it can seem very distant from the kinds of conceptual or historical or theoretical concepts you'd see in a humanities class. There's a different developmental history to STEM disciplines than non-STEM disciplines, including economic, political, and sociocultural factors, things that were born of the space race and No Child Left Behind, the drive for multiple choice testing, and now we have the next generation science standards worked on by some of my former colleagues at the University of Connecticut, including John Settlage and Todd Campbell. All that kind of moved around and out of the way. I wanted to ask you, Trent, as sort of a baseline about STEM and world building, what do you most wonder, think about, or get asked when you're discussing world building for STEM education?
Oh, I thought I was going to ask you that question. But nope. I guess, okay, so you sent that question, and then I was like all prepared for you to answer it. So I think one of the things that I am asked frequently about world building is they need to learn this formula, or they need to learn, these rote materials. How am I going to do that with world building, or how does that have to do with, anything? And that's where, what I always come back to, and I'll throw it back to you and say, well, how do you deal with this? But for me, it's like, oh, well, maybe you don't need to do world building. Maybe it's more of a role play scenario, or the world building is really light, in which you build the world of the 21st century in Cleveland or wherever you're at. And it's a company that you're working at, and imagine this, right? And it's like, so, what if you've got different team members who have different attitudes, or what if your boss is a jerk, or what if people on your team, has to take a leave of absence or gets hit by a train or something like that? Because those are the things that actually you need to be able to deal with when you're in your job, in addition to being able to use the theories that you learn. So I'm thinking that this is something that normally what I would say is that's more of an upper level thing. Like once you have the basics down of how these things work, whatever it is, laws of thermodynamics or whatever it is that they want to be, or physics or whatever. And then it's like, okay, but the world building simulation or role play comes in once you are trying to apply that knowledge to a real world problem, because real world problems do not have neat defined borders. They are shot through with human issues, people's personalities, people's hangups, whether they want a certain answer, even though that's not the best one, budgets, all those other kind of things. So I try and put it into that kind of perspective, that doing the science is always going to be sort of situated in a very specific kind of sociocultural way. It's less, how do I learn how to, make more efficient brakes for a truck? Like, that's not a question that is really well suited. But then how would I do that while working for a company that is based in, wherever? And, those are the kind of ways that I approach it. What do you, but I mean, like, I'm the humanities. I shouldn't say I'm the humanities guy, but I'm more of the humanities guy. You're more of the STEM guy. So what do you say to that? And how would you say bring it into physics or math or something that does require some sort of just flat out memorization of some basic stuff?
Yeah, I struggled with this a lot when I was teaching high school and when I went back to study playful learning. And my original dissertation, the rough draft of it, was focused on turning a biology course, a 1-year-long biology course for sophomores in high school, turning that into some kind of group text-based role-playing game. And for those of you who listened to our discussion with Kevin Balestrini, it was largely the same structure, but for biology education instead of Latin education. So there was this dual alternate reality where the students were taking on the persona of a scientist, but they weren't being the scientist. They were trying to convince simulated non-player characters that they belonged in an era in which they were not actually a part of. They were traveling through time. They were talking to important scientists. They were trying to apply concepts that were related to a given topic. So, for example, when I developed the unit that was focused on microbiology, I set that all in the story world of a war between the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells. The students were on the eukaryotic side as eukaryotic organisms, which just means they're multicellular and evolved into animals and plants and whatnot. The prokaryotic side are single-celled organisms like bacteria. And so the learning objectives threaded throughout that entire unit were all about the practices of being a microbiologist. How do you use a microscope? What does it mean to compare the relative size of a prokaryotic organism with a eukaryotic one? What are the kinds of similarities and differences between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell? All of that was sort of embedded in the story world that was highly fictionalized. It was the students role-playing as these fake scientists to convince these fictional characters they were supposed to belong there. But all of that was set alongside the real world discovery based learning and inquiry that would happen in a science classroom, because you're still doing the lab activities, and all the lab activities, the data that's being collected, the story that the students are telling about their science learning in the context of writing a lab report all fits back into that nested objective that is related to the role playing experience or the alternate reality role playing experience. And that's a little bit different than world building as described in the book, mostly because it's framed around that latter part we've discussed as role playing, where you've built the world, now we're going to put your characters into it. We didn't really co-construct the world in the same way that you would if you were building something from scratch. But the students were, as participants in this environment, much like Kevin described with Operation Lapis, they were co-constructing a version of this reality that I had sort of scaffolded for them. And importantly, this is one place where I think it's easy to make a distinction, but I don't know that I necessarily would, between the technical kinds of learning objectives, like here's how to use a formula, or here's how to use an equation, or whatever it is. I think a lot about like the quadratic formula, or distance equals rate times time, like the kinds of things you would learn in a middle school or high school setting. That can feel very distantly related to the more conceptual, what is the history of science? Who was Gregor Mendel? Those two things seem like they belong in parallel tracks, but I actually think they can be quite similar. Where if the question that you're asking your students to address involves using that technical knowledge, and you've talked about this before as the difference between memorizing a thing and regurgitating it on the test, and liking the word regurgitation because it's vomit, right? Like that's kind of how we treat multiple choice or knowledge-driven kinds of testing. The difference here is that the direct application of those formulas, not memorizing them and telling the teacher, this is the formula, and now I'm going to explain why Alice got 400 apples when she went to the grocery store, and how much would the price differ if she got 300 oranges instead, or whatever word problem, the two trains leaving different cities at different velocities, right? That's the sort of stereotypical idea of what STEM looks like in a classroom, but a more nuanced perspective, and one that I think is well aligned with the next gen science standards, is this integrated approach where you take the formula and you do something with it. I want to hand it back to you for feedback. There's just one more thing I wanted to add really quickly.
I've got questions for you too, so maybe you'll I'll just keep you going.
That's fine too.
I'll take a nap.
I'm happy to just talk and talk and talk. That's one of the nice things about having a podcast when you're ADHD and a professor who, as you've said, put a quarter in us, and we'll just keep going.
That's right.
So the thing I wanted to add before moving on is just that none of this is new, right? Like, I don't want to make this sound like we're saying inquiry-driven or discovery-based or case-based learning didn't happen in science before. I think a lot of great science teachers already do those things. World building and role play, I see as a supplement or a parallel pedagogical approach you would use with the other kinds of inquiry you're doing. So it's not a replacement for doing hands-on lab activities or trying to get students to conceptualize a story about the science they're doing. It's more so the how can you make this maximally constructivist and social
Right.
collaborative.
Well, because
And
that's
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, I didn't. You were on a roll. I was going to say that it's one of those things. Like as you were talking, I was like, oh, everyone always hated word problems, right? Like when you were in math class, and you're like, why don't you just give me the problem rather than saying a train left and a train left? And it's like, oh, because once you actually get out into a career where you need to apply this stuff, it's all word problems all the time. No one needs to have like a
Hmm.
discrete problem that they just drop on your desk and say, can you solve this for me? Because if you know the
Hmm.
stuff, you can do it, right? So I mean, like the being able to figure out
Right.
how to answer the word problem is the skill that we're trying to teach. So I was going to ask, this was the question that I'd queued up, is what's the learning theory that says that we learn better when there is that sort of narrative embedded? Because, for example, I would just say, so you made up the story about the different, cells and blah 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 blah.
Hmm.
But realistically, if you're working in a lab, if you're working for a company, if you're working for a government agency, you're going to have a whole
Right.
list of things, that you need to get done, when you need to get them done by. How does it, in terms of the transfer of doing this, having the narrative and having the story, my point was, is that the story is already there. We just don't think about that because that's what we would just call real life, right? But that's the story of
Hmm.
like, oh, well, we got a grant and now we got
Right.
to do this stuff. Like that's the story. And we just don't think about it that way. What's the learning theory that when we add the narrative, we internalize the learning and contextualize the learning a little bit better?
I'm glad you asked that because that was actually the next thing I was going to say when you jumped in.
That
So
that
thanks
that,
for
that
giving
gives
me a
me a chance.
segue.
I get paid by the
The
word, so this is gonna be a very slim podcast
Oh,
for
see,
me if
they
I don't
pay
get
me by the letter.
that
That's how
letter.
I get reimbursed
Right.
for my time here. The reason why we know this works, and I'm going to put no in air quotes here, but the reason why we know this works is partly because this has been a theoretical premise for pedagogical development for a long time. In our last episode about all the different influential works that most drove our careers, discovery learning by John Dewey was a really important component here. And his argument, he talks about play, but he doesn't mean game-based learning. He
Right. Right.
means more of an inquiry based, I'm going to put my hands on this thing and do the
Right.
task that
Like a
needs to be
Montessori.
transferred, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a Montessori approach. And then as you get further in the 20th century, you get Papert, who has Logo, which is the little turtle that draws pictures on the ground. And that's a form of inquiry based learning. You have the anchored instruction era of the 80s and 90s with the Cognition and Technology Group at Vanderbilt. And they were really specifically focused on the storytelling element here. And that sort of paralleled the Jerome Bruner narrative psychology piece. Now, those are a little bit different because the narrative psychology is more focused on the how do humans use stories to make sense of reality, whereas
Hmm.
Cognition Technology Group at Vanderbilt was more narrowly asking the question, what can we do with stories to help anchor somebody's learning so that it is richly contextualized?
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece that really matters a lot when you're presenting learners, especially in a STEM environment, although not exclusively, with information that you want them to apply in the real world, you need to think, what is the most richly authentic way I can present that information rather than an impoverished way? And
Hmm.
I would argue, and I think there are others who would agree with me on this, that direct instruction is one of the most
Yeah.
impoverished ways you can do that
A
because
textbook, decontextualized problems in a textbook. Yeah.
exactly. And word problems are somewhere kind of in the middle. And I think this is most evidenced when you start comparing them to the Jasper Woodbury series. And just as a quick summary, won't go through the whole thing again because we've talked about it before, but the Adventures of Jasper Woodbury were a series of Laserdisc videos that you would use in a fifth grade or middle school classroom to help learners inquire about some of the concepts, math
Hmm.
concepts, social studies concepts that you would want them to know when they went to high school. There's the famous one about Jasper going out to fish in the wilderness and he finds an injured eagle and that eagle needs to be brought back to town, but he doesn't have easy transport back, so you have
Ah,
to use
right.
a glider to get to him, pick up the eagle, get it home, and you have to basically calculate the perimeter of a triangle and figure out, distance, rate times
Right. Right.
time,
Right.
that sort of thing. What matters about this is that the students are never being told, here's the formula or equation you need to use. They're being given a ton of data and then being told, this is how data actually ends up in your hands in the real world. Now, what we want you to do is figure out, what do I do with this? How do I relate these pieces of information to one another? In the context of Jasper, that was usually aimed at fundamentals of math and social studies. There's another program called The Voyage of the Mimi, which incidentally was the first, if I'm not mistaken, was the first series that Ben Affleck was ever a part of. And it was an
Interesting.
educational laserdisc series like Jasper that was meant to talk about science education and about maritime information and what is it like to live on a boat and what is it like to study whales. Like all of that was sort of embedded in this story about this boat that was a science vessel that would go out to sea. And I, as a student, did the Voyage of the Mimi when I was in middle school. Like that was right at the time when that research was being conducted. And somehow my school ended up with a Laserdisc player, which if you could find one now, I'd be shocked. But
Yeah.
the videos themselves were aimed at getting us to ask good questions about what all the characters on the Mimi were doing.
Yeah.
Just the same way that those fifth graders participating in Jasper Woodbury were being positioned to ask the question, what do I do with this data? How do I help Jasper and his friends?
Yeah.
So in some sense, they're not word problems, but they aren't quite the same thing because
Right.
they're more richly contextual than a word problem would be. There's more information, there are more distractors. So you don't necessarily know whether a piece of information is going to be relevant or not. You're supposed to inquire and discover as sort of a mini scientist or a mini sociologist. You're supposed to do the things that those experts would do in order to learn those skills in a context in which they would apply. And
Right.
the same thing would apply to math, right? If you're doing math in this way, you're doing inquiry-driven math where you're scaffolding for those learners the stuff that really matters about being a mathematician. That's quite a bit different than the stereotypical stand and deliver version of STEM
Right.
education where
Right.
you're at the front of a lecture hall and you're telling these students, here are the equations you need to know. Now memorize them and use them for these 10 problems at the back of the book. That's just a very different kind of approach.
Right. It makes me think too of Katie Salen's Project Chicago Quest, where they have that charter school that the whole curriculum is built around questions, right? Where it's basically the students either are given or formulate questions, and then they have to figure out what do I need to know and what do I need to learn in order to answer this problem or solve this problem, right? And it's a very interesting approach. Can you say more on like how that is sort of working on the same principles?
You're talking about the Quest to Learn school.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that what
yeah.
it's called? I'm
Yep.
trying to remember. It's in New York. Or
They had
I
a
think there's
couple
one
of
in New
them.
York and Chicago.
I think there's one in New York and
exactly.
one in Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a Montessori style education. It's very learner driven. It's all discovery based. They had tried, if I recall correctly, Quest to Learn was specifically trying to use computer science and programming as part of the curriculum too. So they were trying to create environments in which students would naturally learn the various formulae they need to know by positioning them to do the thing for real. And again, this is why I'm saying I don't think there's a huge difference between the humanities and STEM courses. And I also don't think there's a huge difference between world building and other forms of inquiry-driven instruction. It's just that when you start to put all these pieces together, it's going to take a different shape if you add world building than if you focus purely on the I'm solving this specific scientific inquiry. The world building element adds more of the Jasper Woodbury narrative psychology, anchored instruction component, as opposed to the let's go to work just using our hands. We're going to solve problems by fixing things or deconstructing things.
Right.
And those things are simpatico, like they fit together. They can operate in parallel, and I would argue they probably should, but that doesn't mean you have to do them that way. And the benefit, I think, of adopting the world building component is that you can start tying in some of the bigger questions that are not specifically about the technical application of a formula or a tool that, you know, there are some examples in other classes I've developed. In addition to Operation Biome, I worked on a class called Operation Hypnos, which was a role-playing, world-building activity centered on learning theory and psychology. And a lot of that was about the learning theory elements, like what distinguished one kind of learning theory from another. But there was this other thread through it of how do we think about the role of psychology in the development of schools and classrooms? And how do we structure our economies or our governments around the kinds of approaches you can take to constructing a school? Now, those are things that don't traditionally go into a learning class.
Right.
But you can weave them in a way that tells a more, I think, compelling story about how the real world works than if you're just focused on the isolated facts about a thing, which I think is quite a bit.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I mean, that's where too, I had some people from STEM, engineering professors, sort of like, well, how am I going to do, how am I going to do world building with this or storytelling with this? And it's like, well, part of me wants to say, well, what this is all based on is constructionist and constructivist principles, like good learning principles. And if you don't know how to bring those into your classroom, then world building is one way, role play is another, simulation is another. Like, don't worry about the learning theory behind it. Just know that that's why we're encouraging you to think about it this way. And this is where it's like, oh, well, this is so different from everything else. And it's like, well, is everything else working the way you want it to? Right? It's one of those things. Like, it always feels to me, especially in education, that we are operating against the system that we assume is like perfect and can't be changed. And it's like, well, this may not be 100% better, but it may be like 40% better, and better is just better, right? You know what I mean? So like, why wouldn't you want to be jumping on board? So it's less of a like gotcha for me at least, where it's like, oh well, think about soft skills, think about whatever, and also it's not a tool that you need for absolutely every problem. Like that's not the
Hmm.
snake oil that we're selling, but it's like you can figure out ways to incorporate these things into any sort of discipline, because like even if you're doing mathematics or something like that, you're still
Hmm.
trying to solve, you need to know the formulas, you need to know all these things, but you're still trying to solve real world problems that are going to have real world outcomes. And it's bringing that, and maybe that is a little bit later in your training, right? You need to
Hmm.
understand how these things work before you can start doing a full on simulation or something like that. But still, it's one of those things where it's not necessarily supposed to be the skeleton key for all education. The other part I was going to ask about this, and I mean, this is coming from a genuine, I don't know this. What about gamification in some of these areas? Like if you're learning a foreign language, right? And I always use
Hmm.
Duolingo as a good example of gamification, in which the owl giving you a thumbs up and you have a streak of so many days has nothing to do with actually acquiring that language and being able to use
Hmm.
that language. But those are the badges and the flags and the things that keep you motivated, right? And it's got that sort of game component. So
Hmm.
is there at some point, do you think, a use for just sort of the like, it's hard to figure out how would you learn a foreign language without building some base vocabulary first. And that base vocab, but I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But that base vocabulary also, I would think needs, you have a little bit of brute force just to learn the basics. Before you start learning, you got to learn a whole bunch of words before you start plugging them into different parts of the sentence for it to make sense. And it
Hmm.
seems to me that gamification isn't the worst thing in the world. Like we said in an earlier show, I always view gamification as this work that you don't really want to do, but you can actually make it a little bit more interesting. If you
Hmm.
add a little sort of mechanic, game mechanic or points or something like that, just to get through the drudgery. What do you think about that?
I mean, the perspective I've always taken on it is that gamification is just another name for operant conditioning, right? It's
Hmm.
a very specific approach to getting someone to learn something. And this is where it becomes useful to be able to compare across learning theories,
Yep.
because as a designer, you often have to think about, okay, what is the goal that I'm trying to achieve? And do I have the resources necessary, time, energy, money, staff, whatever, to be able to achieve that goal in a way that is optimal? Or am I just approximating something that would be okay, right?
Yeah.
Does it have to be perfect, or can there be some wiggle room? And the main problem slash benefit, I guess, of gamification is that it works for some people. Like that as a
Yeah.
reinforcer, those points, the streak, etc., the little thumbs up from the owl. That could be motivating to somebody. There's no reason it can't be, but the question is that richly authentic, and is it
Right.
a direct application of the thing that you're doing? And in some cases, it could be. If you're practicing through a gamified app, some kind of language that you want to learn, then sure, I think there's probably benefits to doing that in a more traditional quiz-based manner where you're using that simple vocabulary or that early vocabulary. Is that going to get you all the way to where you need to go, where you're conversing fluently in the language in a land full of people who natively speak it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
not, right? Like, and the reason for that is largely because, as I've said many times across many episodes, I'm a situated cognitivist. So I think about all of this as being situated, that
Right.
even the behaviorally reinforced gamified version of Duolingo is situated. It's just not situated richly in the environment in which it would apply. So if
Yeah.
you were living in France, immersed in the culture and the language, your likelihood of being able to pick up the language is much better than if you're just learning French on Duolingo. Of course,
Right.
that comes with trade-offs, right? Like it's hard to live in a place where you don't natively speak the language and are learning it on the fly. So
Yeah.
there are reasons why you would want to approach this with multiple different kinds of learning theories, not a singular one.
Right.
And
Right.
one of my favorite things for my learning science students was always to emphasize to them that there is no one correct learning theory, but there is a difference if you want to ask somebody to write down the directions for how to bake a cake versus bake the cake and do a taste test.
Hmm.
You kind of have to determine, what am I assessing, and
Yeah.
does that comport with the kind of instruction I provided? And operant conditioning or gamification is just a way to hack brain chemistry to get people to do a thing more or less frequently. It's a question of, does that have staying power? And I think the answer is probably no, though it really comes down to the individual and whether that's a valid reinforcer for them. I
Right.
also think back to something that Mike Young has taught me that I've mentioned on the podcast before, this idea that learning is the education of intention and attention.
Hmm.
So the more that you can get somebody to attend to the right thing and then develop intentions that utilize that thing that they're learning, if you consider, as Brown, Collins, and DeGoodt did, that knowledge is doing,
Right.
then that's going to inherently provide a much more richly authentic, contextualized experience than just memorizing how to bake the cake and the instructions that would
Right.
entail,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's a different thing.
It makes me think because I'm in my journey of learning Spanish, and it makes me wonder if I was going to start with a completely different language that I know nothing about, like Korean or something like that. The
Hmm.
process that I used was, and I'll name drop these. These are not sponsors, although they probably should be because I've given them so many props over the years. One company was called Spanish Power. The company was Bilingual America, and they've kind of changed their focus. But the way that worked was the guy Ricardo Gonzalez, I think his name was, basically said, out of all the Spanish verbs, 70% or whatever it is, 80% are regular. So what he did was said, let's start, and this is very different than any way that you would learn a language in school, is let's just start by learning these 9 or 10 different forms. It's basically, two for the present, 3 for the future, and then whatever it is, 5 or 6 for the past or whatever. And learn all of for the 70% of the regular verbs, AR, IR, and ER verbs, they're conjugated in this way, right? And that was just sort of like you got to grunt force your way to learn that, to memorize those different endings and whatever. And then each chapter was a year-long program, and each chapter that took about a week is it would start with 25 or 35 note cards that you just needed to you go through them 10 times, and then you
Hmm.
go through them 9 times, and then you go through them 8 times, right? And then so you do that on the first day, and then it's about plugging all of those words into sentences and structures, and then you'd listen, you do some comprehension or
Hmm.
whatever. And then once you built all that up, right at the end of the day, you can actually say quite a lot. You can do a lot,
Hmm.
but there's that one moment of the sort of grunt effort where you just need it in the front to just binge on the memorization part.
Hmm.
And then there's this other system that I've been using from Ollie Richards. It's now called story learning, which it's all about you learn foreign languages through reading stories, right? And his whole
Hmm.
thing is it's basically what we've been saying is like, oh, you know what, you're going to learn what these words mean in context a lot better than you are from
Hmm.
not, right? So you read this story, you may not understand. This is the part that I get frustrated with. It's like, you're not going to understand everything. And I'm reading like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? Which is very flowery, ornate stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but as long as you get the gist, that is cemented in your head and you put all of these things within context of each other, right?
Hmm.
So it seems to me, and that's where, now he's got an AI program that basically generates new stories using the vocabulary that you want, which I think is kind of cool, right? But then you go
Hmm.
through it and it's one of those things where you're like, oh, well, I want to know what happens next in the story. So therefore I will put forth sort of that effort. But I guess that would be sort of the question that I would lob to you, because this is where too, thinking about how you do this for STEM, thinking about how you would do this for medicine or something like that. I don't
Hmm.
teach any of those things, right? Like I teach classes that are heavily humanities based, basically English with a heavy dose of history and philosophy. So I know exactly how it works for that and for generally most of the social sciences too. Like I could figure it out well enough to be able to say like, oh, you
Hmm.
can do this, you can do that. But then when you start getting into these other areas where I'm just thinking like in medicine, it's another area where traditionally it's a lot of rote learning that then is put
Hmm.
into practice through, clinical exams and things like that. But are there ways to either mitigate that sort of brute force, learning in the beginning, or is that just part and parcel of some things you need to know? You need to understand everything at the ground floor. At the ground floor, you really just need repetition. Or is there a clever way to, make that more narrative based, even times tables or something like that? Are there ways to do world building simulations, role plays, whatever, for that really kind of basic knowledge?
It's funny because as you were saying all that, all I could think is teachers hate this one weird
Yeah,
trick,
right,
right? It's
exactly.
just that's kind of how it feels, and that's actually kind of the reason why I wanted to do an episode about STEM is because I don't think that a lot of science or math educators think about it that way, but I
Hmm.
can definitely see how somebody could have a perspective that looks at STEM as primarily just memorizing
Right,
stuff.
right,
Especially if you took, say, a chemistry course and you had to memorize the periodic table.
right.
That's maybe a stupid example, but if you've taken a physics class, there are certain formulae you would need to learn to be able to apply in certain situations for, I don't know, momentum or
Yeah.
gravity or what to understand where these things came from conceptually. So there's this tension between the stuff you have to memorize and the stuff that is, I think for some people it feels superfluous, like the
Hmm.
history and the
Right,
theory
right, right,
and the,
right.
this is something I wanted to get to earlier, so I'm glad you kind of introduced an opportunity to talk more about it. The differentiation between how the humanities and STEM have been treated socially,
Right,
economically, politically is not incidental here. Like, I think
right, right,
part of the reason why the question you asked even exists is because STEM has for a long time been driven towards these more standardized kinds of testing, that it's empirical, I'm putting that in air quotes,
right,
right?
right,
That it's because it's quantifiable and it's not qualitative, that there's
right.
something unique or different about it that means
Well,
the quantity has value, but the quality does not.
yeah, well, I was just going to say, because this is also bringing back PTSD, flashbacks of me growing up, where it's like I was never really inclined towards numbers and towards, formulas and empirical stuff. I'm a dreamer. I always have been. It's always about stories and how to, language and whatever. And I was very much made to feel K through 12 that that was a lesser skill. That was something that was not as important. And if you couldn't do the math and science, then you were a lesser student, right? And it speaks right to that, and it's probably something that I still have that hangover today, right? You know what I mean? Where I'm like, oh, I don't get the math and the science, and it's like, well, to a certain degree, humans learn stuff in a certain way, and it doesn't matter what you're learning, fly fishing or particle physics, right? I mean, it's like
Mm-hmm.
you're learning is the meat space in our heads that we got to understand that before we can understand anything else.
I wish we could put that in the book. That learning is the meat space in our heads.
That's
Perfect.
right. That's
How
yeah.
could you write a better line than
It
that
could
to
be a
advocate for
t-shirt or
this?
a tattoo.
Both of which are coming to the World Building Workshop store online
Or I
any
could
day
just,
now.
yeah, I could get a tattoo of a t-shirt that says that.
Perfect. So to get back on topic, I think what you've done is highlighted the false dichotomy, right? There never should have been a reason
Right.
for you to think that those two things weren't related or complementary in some way. And I think that artificial differentiation between them that happens in K through 12 and higher ed and industry, that some of those are seen as more valuable than others. And that more valuable bit is heavily connected to capitalistic outcomes because engineering creates widgets that can be sold, right? There's
Yeah,
an
exactly.
impetus there to
Exactly.
focus time and attention on that because there's a real economic benefit that helps the system we have continue to function. And I think it can be easy to read too much into what I'm saying here as if I'm saying there's no value in engineering because it's only tied to capitalism. That's not what I'm trying to say. And maybe that's not a real argument anyone would make. But
I'd make
I
it, but
guess, yeah.
just kidding. Just kidding.
But I think that the mistake that a lot of educational institutions make is convincing students that the stuff about history and context or art isn't as important as the stuff that's about the numbers, when in reality, they require each other to mean
Yeah.
anything,
Yeah.
right? That you can't solve most of the world's problems with just one thing. And even I'll use climate change as an example, right? That if you can scientifically, mathematically predict where forest fires are going to start, that's one thing.
Right.
But it's another to convince people to care about that and to
Yeah.
make them value the work that scientists do and to connect people to the natural world. Like those are all things that are different. And I often have said that Carl Sagan is one of my scientific heroes, but part of the reason for that isn't the astronomy cosmology part, although that is significant to me. It's the fact that he was a really effective science communicator. And that is a different skill set than just knowing how to apply a formula. And I don't think any less important than being able to do the math that tells you where a black hole is, or how far away a star is, or which planets might fall in Goldilocks zones that are potential harbors of life. Like those things are all interconnected with one another. And it's one of the reasons why I try to emphasize when I was still teaching teachers that you really do need to find a way to integrate those things into a single class. The
Yeah.
challenge is if all the money and time and energy is
Exactly.
pointed at memorize, regurgitate, that's very different than allowing educators to incorporate the things that quote unquote aren't on the test.
Right.
And again, it's not because those things aren't important. It's because we have decided as a society that we are deprioritizing those things in favor of these other things because we think that it is easier to see the value or output, the productivity as a consequence of that, which I
Right.
don't think is true, but I think that is largely how society has, at least Western society, has structured
Right.
itself.
Right. Right. And I think that's where too, to go back to the capitalism thing that we'll happily knock on. But it's, it's one of those things where if you're just learning formulas and what you believe to be empirical truths, then there's nothing to question. There's nothing to tear down. It's just like you do as you're told, right? Which is
Mm.
very much in the service of the status quo of the people who already have the power and don't want to relinquish power. Why would you want people to critically think and, be able to ask questions about how you got there? But when you were talking too, I can't remember whether I've talked about this before on the podcast or wrote about it in the book, but the School of Integrated Liberal Studies at UW-Madison, I took one of the classes to get out of having to do a science lab. It was one of the ways that you could do a science credit without doing a science lab. And it's basically probably the best class I took in college was one of these integrated liberal studies, 3 units. It was on Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. And it was all about what was the world of Isaac Newton and what was it that he was reading and what was it that was, what art was being produced and what was being talked about in the streets and what was the philosophy of the time, because the whole thing was pushing the class was very much pushing against the lone genius, idea and much more pushing on the we are products of our environment, right? And I think this is one of the things too that as I'm listening to you talk about this and I'm thinking, oh, well, one of the big problems too that I see is that when I'm reading a novel or if I'm writing a story or if I'm learning whatever it is, it's so like, oh, that's just a school thing, right? Like I just got to learn that for school and that will make me better. As opposed to, well, you and I are swimming through the same kind of sea of influences that Darwin and Einstein and Newton were, right? And it's like, it's not like we've got more or less or whatever. It's like they were able to synthesize things. And that's what we actually need people to do today, right? It's not how do you use AI or how do you use this or how do you use that? It's like you've got all of these tools across computing and social media, but then also, soft skills and whatever. So how do you take all of that stuff and shape it to something that makes sense to you and that you feel good about putting out into the world, and all those kind of things. And yeah, it's very much as the complexity goes up, and this is also, I can rant about this forever. As the complexity goes up, I don't understand why on-the-job training is no longer a thing. Like, why is it the university's job to teach 10 million different types of jobs that students may have, as opposed to teaching them the foundations and then having, something crazy like their job teach them how to do their job, right? Like, there's only so much, you do need to understand a certain amount of physics or whatever, but just choking people with more and more and more and teaching them nothing about physics from first grade on is actually going to produce worse physicists, right? Than having a really rich kind of education that draws from lots of different things. This is like in my creative writing classes too. We do lots of different writing experiments that are about playing with language, not necessarily doing anything that has deep and profound meaning, but trying to figure out how do words sound together, how do they what's the rhythm of a sentence, all that kind of stuff, even if it means nothing. And then I had a student who is one of my best students, industrial engineering student, who said, oh, I took that same kind of strategy and applied it to a problem I was working on in industrial engineering. I took all the different things and started playing with them, and whatever. He's like, I actually came up with a much better solution than the one that our team had come up with originally. I'm like, yeah, see, that's the whole point. It's creative thinking and thinking about here are the materials that you have and what are you going to produce with them, rather than first you do this, second you do that, third you do that, and then you will get a known output. It's like, well, yeah, but what if you want to get something that you don't know how it's made yet, right? Like you need to have that plasticity in your thinking to be able to understand how things go together, how they come apart, and then how maybe you could start putting things together that historically or traditionally haven't gone together. Like that's where innovation kind of comes from. But like you're saying, the funding and the cultural importance really is just on one side of the highway there, right? Like I could say this is starving humanities scholar that, yeah, there is not a lot that is invested on. And I think part of it might be because getting a book, reading it, and then writing an essay does not cost a lot, whereas getting a computer lab with high-end computers running expensive software does cost a lot. So then maybe our values start to switch because of that, right? Like because we've spent so much money on the tech, we now need to prioritize it, which to me is just it's very, very short-sighted. And again, this is where I think the major problem with higher education in the United States right now is it is operating on this capitalistic model that really didn't hit in high gear until the early 90s, right? I mean, it's like none of that was taking off until the 90s. And now it's like, oh, look at what we've sown after, a quarter century of doing this. Everyone thinks college sucks. right? It's too expensive and it doesn't, and it's like, oh, well, I wonder if we just went back to doing what it did really well, whether that wouldn't be like a smart idea, have employers train their employees. But that's a long ramble that maybe doesn't need to be rambled any further.
Well, I think one of the takeaways from it is, for one thing, I do think some amount of on-the-job training does happen, although it's usually very targeted. And
Right.
as somebody who has been developing this kind of training or overseeing a team that develops this kind of training, it is very specialized and not transferable out of that environment. Whereas the broad critical thinking skills and empathy skills, those are transferable and really valuable. And I think, interestingly, this is one of the reasons why there has been an uptick recently in the number of employers seeking people with humanities backgrounds because they have critical thinking and empathy skills as opposed to rote knowledge of how to do a task or how to use
Right.
a formula. Because they'd rather have the people who know how to do or are really adept at doing the kind of root cause analysis you'd want them to do to save you money, to save you time, to find efficiencies, all of the things they say they want that they weren't achieving with just technical knowledge.
Right, right, right.
And this is where I think it's useful to bring up the book A Time for Telling by Schwartz and Bransford.
I was going to ask about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason why I bring it up is because the argument that they make ultimately is not that direct instruction is never useful or that rote memorization is never useful or that teaching technical information that is directly applicable to some specific job isn't useful. It's that if you do that and you don't lay a foundation first for that information to live in,
Right.
it doesn't ever transfer out of that environment where it was taught. So,
Right.
and this is why the Gick and Holyoake analogical problem solving paper that I keep mentioning is so relevant. It's because you need to situate the learning for somebody to understand what to do with it. And one of the important elements that crosses over between A Time for Telling and Gick and Holyoake's work is this idea of contrasting cases or case-based reasoning. It's this whole raison d'etre of the Jasper Woodbury series, the Voyage of the Mimi, all of these other inquiry-driven approaches that you want to give learners multiple cases that they can look at and find the things that are similar and different about them so that when they go out into the world, they have experience doing that comparison and contrasting between different kinds of contexts, which is why the student example you gave of somebody taking information learned from your class and applying it in industrial engineering, that's transfer, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
far transfer. It's the thing that's really difficult to achieve because it requires the learner to have those generator sets or experience with multiple generator sets that then they can use to detect the invariance and then look at that industrial engineering problem and say, oh my God, it never occurred to me before, but this pattern looks a lot like this pattern. So in a way, it's kind of teaching pattern recognition through giving multiple cases. But where this becomes, I think, really relevant to the STEM conversation specifically is in the context of engineering with human consequences.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
for example, the Challenger shuttle explosion or what happened at 3 Mile Island or more notably at Chernobyl. We reference some of those things in the book, but the reason why I keep going back to them as examples is because all the engineering stuff, all the memorized content couldn't stop the human error from interfering with that. So if you
Yeah.
make a mistake, that's going to cause a bad outcome, even if you did the math right. In the Challenger example, you had one piece of the shuttle that was not designed for the temperature at which it was operating, and that caused a fatal, catastrophic outcome. So the engineering ethics matters just as much as the engineering rote memorization formula stuff. And this is why I kept saying I think it's kind of a false dichotomy to separate them is
Right.
you can teach both of those things together, right? That's the
Right.
whole point. If you create a really well thought out engineering ethics story to accompany the kinds of things that the learners need to do in the lived world,
Yeah.
then you solve two problems at the same time. One of them being the more quantifiable mathematical problem, and the other being the more human centric social problem.
Right.
And this is, I know we've talked about them before, but this is kind of the aim of Tori Wagner and Dan Berkey's work on Mars, an engineering expedition, where they're trying to teach future engineers that you can't just do the math. You have to think more about the ethical consequences of your decision making and what trade-offs are going to have to be made as an engineer that ultimately contribute to your decision about whether to follow through with the thing. It's no different than Oppenheimer and the construction of the first atomic bomb, right?
Right.
You're trying to decide what are the benefits and drawbacks of doing this thing. If I don't do it, will somebody else do it? What are the human factors that are contributing to this? What if one of my engineers is on the team and has a really bad day and makes a mistake? Like all stuff to kind of take into account in addition to the here's how I'm going to apply my physics formula to make sure that the problem I'm solving has the right mathematical outcome. And
Yeah.
I think the best examples of world building in this context are when you have learners co-constructing the social, governmental, economic environment around the problem that they're solving. So, for
Yeah.
example, if you had them build their own society, but focus on the more science and technology elements of that society, those substructures are still going to intersect with the governmental and
Right.
economic ones.
Right.
So you have to kind of ask these broader questions of, okay, you noticed that there's a 30% chance of failure in your crop management for the space station that you're working on. How are you going to convince the people who need to be convinced that that's a risk worth taking? And what evidence would you use to support that? Now, your data is going to come from that mathematical side of the equation, not to use a pun, but the other half of the equation, the part that's about the persuasion, the communication, the ethics, that has to be woven into the math. So you're really doing both things simultaneously. And I think it's a mistake. And this is why I really appreciate the next generation science standards because they correct for this mistake. But it would be a mistake to pretend that those two things are different.
Right, right. And it just makes me think too, like as we're talking and thinking about both on the side of people who like to be the sage on the stage, they like to lecture. I remember reading something that was saying an enormous number of professors today are the kinds of people who like lectures, right? And that's just the way that they like to receive information that way. And I listen to the great courses lectures all the time. I actually prefer listening to somebody lecture than to read a book on, read a book on that topic or whatever. But that's not all the people in the room. And in fact, that's probably not even the majority of the people in the room. So just because you like it and you liked it so much, you wanted to go do it for your job, right? That now it's like, oh, well, no, you got to be thinking about all your learners, and whatever, rather than just doing this thing that you like. But it strikes me as very much like I've had some pretty negative interactions with people, specifically in engineering, and then sometimes in computer science at my institution, where I'd say their attitude, and it's not a minority, it is, I don't know whether it's a majority, but it is a significant population that think at best these classes, humanities classes and gen ed, are a waste of time. And at worst, they absolutely get in the way of things that are more important, right? And it makes me think, oh, okay, well, it just reminds me of all the stuff, all the great tech bro apps that come out. There was one that I just saw this week that was a running app that will show people your exact location. So you could then get crowd funded, cheered on, like, oh, you're going to go up this big hill and good for you or whatever. And then it was flooded with all these women runners who were like, you're basically telling everybody where's the best spot to attack you if you're out for a run, right? Like, show me that this was an app that was made by all men without telling me that it was made by all men, right? And it's like, it's that kind of thing where that is a question that for me should not be occurring to somebody once you've already launched it. Like that's a product that is going to fail hard. Or like there's one too earlier in the early days of Google Maps that someone had an app that showed you where all of the children's playgrounds were in a city. And it turned out, hey, it's being used by pedophiles, right? So, I mean, yes, it was being used by parents, but it's also being used by pedophiles. So the idea that these things are somehow separate, like the classic chaos theory Jurassic Park line that you probably know better than I do, but you're so busy, asking whether it can be done, you're not asking whether it should be done or something like that. And it's like that needs to start at probably like birth, right? And then just baked into everything we do, that they're not separate. It's the same thing with disciplines, right? Where it's like we disciplines exist because we created them to parcel out different kinds of knowledge, not because that's the way we experience the world. And I feel like we've gone so far in that direction I mean, maybe this is a totally another ADHD ramble, but that's like, it feels like it's all of a piece where if you just want to do the one thing that you like and the one thing that you are particularly good at, there are going to be collateral damage and ramifications that this is why you need to be able to understand the world from a variety of different perspectives, because it's not just you, right? And it's so.
I'm going to take your ADHD ramble and I'm going to try to do the weave and pull it all together. Okay.
Professors love it.
The professors do love it. I'm going to go back first to your example about the two different Spanish education apps. This idea that you have one that does the more traditional brute force, memorize the words, versus the I'm going to contextualize all the content by putting it in a story and you're going to read that story and hopefully pick up some along the way. That dichotomy, I think, is a reflection of the kinds of thinking that you're describing when you talk about how apps are developed with the mindset of one kind of person, but not taking into account the
Yeah.
other kinds of people in the world, right? So Meta is having this problem right now with their smart glasses, which have a camera built into them, which unsurprisingly has been used for a bunch of things that people don't like. And specifically, some users have been turning off or disabling the light on the front of the glasses that's supposed to indicate that they're recording, which means that they could be recording anywhere, anytime, and
Any
nobody would know.
conversation. Yeah.
Now, Meta has said that they're going to solve this problem by making it so that the camera will not operate if you have tampered with the LED that's on the front of the glasses, which then makes me wonder, okay, well, why didn't you create that in the first place instead of letting the problem manifest and then go back and solve a problem you could have headed off at the pass? All of this kind of threads together around the idea that those disciplines, being as artificially created as they are, don't have to be that way. And we can start reorganizing, or we should reorganize higher education around the idea that everything is inherently interdisciplinary. But one area of education that already does this very well is elementary, where students are learning by doing. Almost everything they're doing is hands-on because they can't read. So if you have, for the most part, I would say kindergartners, first graders, second graders, they're not reading to learn information. They are participating in a socially collaborative experience that is teaching them about how the world works. Now, yes, obviously that information is rudimentary in a lot of ways. They're just getting the very, very foundation needed for understanding things like cause and effect and how to do science and how to put words together to form meaning, right? All of that stuff is very much at the base level, but all of it is done in a richly authentic way. That the best environments for young kids are those in which they can play, in which they can experiment, in which they can practice those skills without fear of failure. We just changed the rest of the education system after about third or fourth grade to be more oriented to that artificial disciplinary siloed structure because that was more efficient and streamlined for the goal of getting people out into the workforce to go do a task. This is why I think there's a really strong argument and a big desire among parents for environments where their kids do have somewhat more free-form educational experiences, because that's what's going to cultivate the kind of creative thinking that you're going to want. And again, referring back to the Spanish apps, you probably are going to want more of the latter, where it's embedded in the story of what it is they need to do with this information, than the former, where they're just memorizing through brute force the way that the world, quote unquote, works. There will always be some amount of both of those things. I don't think you can have a learning experience that is all one and not the other.
Sure.
But the more richly contextualized and richly authentic that experience, the lower the barriers to transfer, and the more likely it is that learners will ultimately be able to identify the patterns from the learning environment out in the real world where they can make a big difference.
Yeah. And that's, I think the thing too, for the one that was a little bit more, at least started with the brute force and then went through more traditional sort of language methods. The thing that was really impressive about it is you see the results almost instantly. Like you can start saying, oh, I walked to school, or like in the first week, you can also say, I walked to school, or I will walk to school, right? And it's like, it's kids spend years before they start learning different tenses, right? And it's like, oh, well, I can say that now. And it's also, as an adult, you're like, oh, well, I take Spanish, or I'm learning Spanish because I obviously really like Spain, but I also like Latin American culture. And it has changed. Like my trips are so much better now that I can hold conversations with locals, right? I've done it in Spain and done it in Costa Rica, done it in Mexico, where I can hold a decent conversation for however long, hours, on a variety of subjects, because that's the payout. And it's like, oh, well, grammar doesn't really, no one ever corrects your grammar. You know what I mean? Like you will always find those places where you can't quite express yourself and they don't know what you mean. And then you just kind of go, okay, well, then you move on, right? It's not like you get a D on that section of the conversation or anything like that. And I think that's one of the things too, that output is, it's the same thing where it's like, that's what is, so many times students will say it's fun, is the engaging part is this actually has application for things I want to do in my life. You know what I mean? And it's like, and it makes it increases, that's what I would say, is that learning Spanish has increased the quality and the enjoyment I have in my life. So that's why I continue to do it. And it's like, there may be things that you don't necessarily would like, but you should learn because they're good for you, right? And then there's the other things. As you get older and older, you can start to specify and, narrow a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, I really don't like especially like what's happening now is that with the higher ed, the idea that when you come in, you have to know your major and you have to know your career path. I'm like, you're
Hmm.
17, 18 years old. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't have that pressure, and I would have never thought that I was going to turn out doing whatever it is that I'm doing now, right? And it's like, it just seems so clearly boneheaded and short-sighted, but that just seems like, and again, that's where, my good old Marxism comes out. And it's like, oh, well, the reason why is because capitalism is all about short-sighted and, like what can you get for that immediate gratification? But I wonder whether there's something about when you learn something fun, or it's like, when I was taking fly fishing classes, the first time you catch a fish, you're elated. You know what I mean? It's like, oh my God, I can't believe that the hours that I spent practicing actually have paid off or whatever. And we're a very impatient society. So I wonder if that also maybe plays into it a little bit.
I would assume yes. I don't think there's any reason it wouldn't. And I also, you had mentioned medical education or healthcare earlier. I think that's a really useful framework for kind of understanding the different approaches and why delayed versus immediate gratification is such a thing. Partly it is the sort of capitalistic mindset, or at least if not capitalistic, it is much more the I want to get the instant gratification to check the box to say I did the thing so that I can move on with my life versus the I can accept the delayed gratification, or in the context of education, it would be more of a I will wait to see the payoff of the learning until much further down the
Right,
line.
right.
Part of that is driven by learners, part of it is driven by institutions, part of it is driven by individual faculty or teachers. And when I worked for the University of Connecticut Health Center for both the medical school and the dental school, there was a strict binary between those two things, or a dividing line between them, where the medical school was much more in the fixed immediate
Yep,
gratification camp. The
yep.
dental school was very much more in the flexible delayed
Mm.
gratification camp. And you could see it reflected in the kinds of activities, pedagogies, and assessments that they were deploying. The medical school was almost universally lecture-based direct instruction without contextualizing in some kind of richly authentic context.
Yeah.
The dental school, that's pretty much all they did, was try to create richly authentic contexts in which the information would be applied. So their exams, quote unquote, were not multiple choice or short answer exams.
Yeah.
They were demonstrations, and they weren't delivered once. They were delivered multiple times throughout a semester so a student could develop a portfolio. And the important part was the student reflection on the portfolio that was filled with examples of their treatment plans, of their actual work on dental models, et cetera. And there's no reason the same thing couldn't be done in medical school too. I
Sure.
think really good medical schools already do this, where they try to present the learners not with just direct instruction and a multiple choice test, where they are checking that box and saying, yes, I know
Yeah.
where the scapula
And
is. Yes, I
it's
know
all
how a
about
bladder works.
it's all about volume in that case too. It's like how much
Yeah.
crap can you stuff into your head in the shortest time possible without
Mhm.
any thought of how much of this stuff is just going to leak out your ears 48 hours after you take that test, right?
And that's one of the reasons why the job training piece fits into this too. It's not just for STEM, but in general, when you go onto a job, you're being delivered all your training right up front as this
Hmm.
is what you do before you go do the work. When in reality, it takes time to internalize a lot of those processes or terms or whatever it is you need to learn. And so a more sensible model would distribute the learning across a longer time span, but foreground all the most important foundational stuff that you can get started with in the first couple of weeks. Then you come back 3 months later for the next round of trainings on the more advanced topics. And then 3 months after that, the same thing should apply in healthcare environments and in STEM environments where, yeah, there are the sort of facts you need to know about the thing in order to quote unquote understand it and do the work. But there's no reason why that can't be stepwise, and there's no reason why you can't use the time for telling Bransford and Schwartz
Right,
model,
right, right.
where you use the story as a place to set up that information and start building out the generator sets that a learner will be able to refer back to later on
Yep.
and say, I remember when we studied this thing 3 months ago. Now I can take the next step and focus on the more advanced application of that idea that I didn't know. And I know I had mentioned Bruner earlier today and have also mentioned it in previous podcasts, but Bruner's narrative psychology is built around the idea of a spiral curriculum where you
Hmm.
start with that kernel of an idea and you just circle around and you come back to that same idea with
Yeah.
another layer of more advanced information or knowledge, and you just keep doing that over and
Yeah,
over.
it makes me think, my father-in-law sends me about 400 or 500 links a day to check out, and some of them are expert, science teachers or whatever. And as you're talking, it really strikes me. It's the thing, like, the example of the professor who has the bowling ball on a line, puts it up to their nose and then drops it and it swings across the room and it swings back and does not bash their teeth in, right? Or it's like the other ones are like, oh, what do you think is going to happen if I add this to this? Like, what do you think is going to be the reaction? And, then everyone's like, oh, blah, 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 I don't know, right? And then they do it and it does something completely, different than what they expected.
Chemistry is the study of matter, but I prefer to see it as the study of change. Now, just think about this. Electrons, they change their energy levels. Molecules change their bonds. Huh? Elements, they combine and change into compounds. Well, that's all of life, right? I mean, it's the constant, it's the cycle, it's solution, dissolution, just over and over and over. It is growth, then decay, then transformation. It is fascinating, really.
So then the question naturally is, well, why did it do that? Like, I want to know what the chemistry was or what the physics were that made that react. And it's exactly that you've now seeded for that time of telling, where it's like, oh, now that I'm interested, I'll sit here and understand why. I mean, this is where, too, I always say to my students, too, because sometimes they're like, oh, my God, do you know everything? And I'm like, well, dude, I'm like over twice as old as you. Right? Like a lot of that is just mileage. You know what I mean? Where it's like I've read a ton, I've, watched a lot of movies, whatever. And it's like, oh, and that just accumulates. But yeah, and it's like that can happen to you as long as you just keep being interested in the world. But yeah, that whole idea that and it's not real difficult to be able to frame things, especially like if we're into job training, like, well, this is what your job will be. Like you'd said before too, like you didn't like your job in a bio lab, right? And it's like, oh, well, do you even know what you're going to be doing? Because like if you really like doing, the same repetitive task to petri dishes, maybe you will like that, or maybe like whatever. But it just reminds me too that my brothers are both engineers. My older brothers are engineers, and they said they had no idea what engineering was or what it was that they were going to be doing. It's just that they were good at math and science, and people who are good in math and science should be engineers, right? And it's like neither one of them are engineers today. They've had very successful careers, but and everyone says, oh, well, engineering is more about a way of helping you learn to think and problem solve than it is about actually whether you're an industrial or a civil engineer or whatever.
I think that's actually a great thesis for this whole conversation. The notion that whatever your major was, whatever the courses you took in high school, that's not the thing that actually matters. The disciplinary silos don't matter at all. It is just have I learned enough interesting dynamic ways to look at reality that I can draw conclusions from different kinds of data under different circumstances?
Yeah.
And that's really the core of situated cognition as a learning theory. It's me as an individual being in dialogue with the environment around me and finding different affordances in that environment that help me solve different kinds of problems. And the way that I detect affordances will be different than the way you detect affordances, because all of that is going to be determined by the context we grew up in, the different kinds of information we've been exposed to, the different sensory experiences we've had. So it is incredibly individualistic. And also you can craft learning environments that allow learners to start making connections between disparate areas of information and practice using these lenses, which is exactly where we started, this idea that STEM is not inherently different than any other subject. When you're thinking about world building, it's just how do you decide what elements of the world to emphasize, and then how are you telling the learners or helping the learners understand how those different lenses fit into different ways of interpreting their lived reality.
Yeah, it's like you said before too. Like it's about learning to ask better questions, and then the other side of that is, well, what is a good strategy for getting those questions answered? Right, like ask better questions, and then figure out how do we answer them that isn't a scattershot. You could be methodical and like bring your critical thinking to it and break things down into smaller kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think that is an important facet of this, is how are students learning to decompartmentalize things and then be able to use the intersections between different disciplines to be able to solve real world problems, much in the same way that if you are a scientist working on climate change, your job isn't really just tracking weather, right? Like there's a lot more to it that involves the social, economic, political influences that affect the work that a climate scientist does. If you're somebody who has been working for years to develop a new kind of solar panel or an electric car that's more efficient, or you're trying to get more wind turbines installed somewhere, you're going to need all kinds of scientific knowledge, but you're also going to have to be aware of the political landscape that you're operating in, and why do towns favor or disfavor having different kinds of technologies built into them, and who are the people who are happiest to have the wind turbines versus the people who are unhappiest, and is there a way to craft a message that would persuade somebody on some of those topics? All of that is just as important as the quote-unquote science and math, which I don't really think is different than the humanities components.
Great. That's a great way to end it, I think, because that's sort of where you start. You've bookended that classic tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. That's what my 8th grade speech teacher, Mr. Sproul, taught us.
That's a useful little ditty.
Yeah, and you just did it. I did not get along with him, and I mean he's probably dead now. But there's that. So I think we should
Silver linings.
Silver linings, yeah. So the good news is the older you get, most of your K through 12 teachers will have died. So that's, I guess, the best.
All right.
Well, look at the time.
Look at the time. Great talking to you, buddy.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to do this again soon on another fun topic. And until then, enjoy your rainy afternoon. At least it's rainy here.
It is rainy here as well. So hopefully it's not raining where you are and you're enjoying the tropical weather.
That's right.
Au revoir, friends.
Adios.
Au revoir.
Adios, to use my
Auf Wiedersehen.
All right.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.